Winter, 1944. The snow over Oklahoma lay untouched, a pale silence broken only by the dull rhythm of hammers. Inside the wire fences of Camp Tonkawa, a dozen German prisoners stood around a wooden frame that rose slowly from the frozen earth. Their breath hung in the air like smoke as they lifted boards salvaged from supply crates, rough pine that would soon form the walls of something unexpected. A chapel. An American guard leaned against a post, rifle slung behind him, watching without a word. The prisoners worked in near silence, humming faint hymns that drifted through the cold morning light. No one barked orders. No overseer shouted. Just the sound of men, former enemies, building a house of faith in a land that had once been their enemy's dream. By noon, a cross made from scrap wood stood upright between the barracks. Even the guard found himself staring at it. He'd never thought mercy could look like this. Quiet, patient, and made of splinters. Even in captivity, they were being shown a freedom they'd never been taught. By the middle of 1943, the war in Europe had begun to turn against Germany. The Allies were closing in from all directions. Africa liberated, Italy invaded, bombers striking deep into the heart of the Reich. Yet across the Atlantic, far from the front lines, another war was unfolding quietly on American soil. One fought not with bullets, but with ideals. The United States was suddenly host to an army of the defeated. Cargo ships that once carried tanks and fuel to the front were now returning with captured German soldiers, thousands at a time. They came in convoys across the Atlantic, passing the same waters where U-boats once hunted American ships. Many expected punishment, even execution. Instead, they were greeted by military police, paperwork, and the sight of endless farmland. By 1945, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war in more than 500 camps scattered from California to New England. From the deserts of Arizona to the plains of Texas and Oklahoma, these camps were fenced, guarded, and run with military discipline. But to most who entered, they felt less like prisons and more like small, contained towns. Each camp had its own kitchen, infirmary, library, and even newspapers printed in German. The War Department, under the guidance of the Geneva Convention of 1929, had ordered that enemy prisoners be treated with dignity. This wasn't out of sentiment. It was strategy. America believed that humane treatment could do what bullets could not: break the ideology of Nazism by comparison. The logic was simple. Every German prisoner who experienced fairness and freedom, even behind barbed wire, might return home carrying a new vision of what civilization could look like. "We are not fighting the German soldier," one American officer explained. "We are fighting the German idea." Many Americans disagreed. Families who had lost sons in France saw the camps as too lenient. "Country clubs for Nazis," newspapers called them. Yet inside the War Department, leaders such as General George Marshall and Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy held firm. They argued that America's moral power depended not on revenge, but restraint. If the United States stooped to cruelty, it would lose the very thing it claimed to defend. And so, the experiment began. German POWs were paid modest wages for labor, farming, logging, repairing roads, or working in canneries. They received medical care, clothing, and food nearly equal to what American soldiers ate. They could send and receive letters home, read censored newspapers, and even attend educational programs where professors from local colleges taught them English, democracy, and economics. But among all these freedoms, one stood out as most shocking to the prisoners themselves: religion. Back home, faith had long been fused with ideology. The Nazi regime had distorted Christianity, turning sermons into propaganda about obedience and racial destiny. True worship had been suppressed or politicized. Many German soldiers, raised in that climate, had learned that prayer was an act of duty, not conscience. Yet here, inside the enemy's fences, no one dictated what they could believe. At first, the Americans had little idea how deeply this would matter. Camp commandants simply followed the convention's clause, allowing prisoners to practice their religion freely. Chaplains were assigned, Bibles distributed, and Catholic priests or Lutheran ministers among the prisoners were permitted to hold services. To most guards, it seemed like a minor administrative matter. But to the Germans it was disorienting. They had prepared for humiliation. Instead, they found tolerance. In some camps, such as Camp Ruston in Louisiana and Camp Atterbury in Indiana, prisoners began requesting wood, nails, and time-off labor duties to build makeshift chapels. Commanders hesitated at first. The idea of Nazi soldiers constructing places of worship on U.S. soil felt almost absurd, but approval came nonetheless, and soon hammers began to ring. Within months, dozens of POW camps across America echoed with hymns sung in German. Crude wooden chapels stood beside barracks and mess halls, crosses made from leftover lumber, altars from ammunition crates. In these spaces, men who once marched under the swastika now knelt before a different authority, one they were beginning to understand. The simple act of allowing it had begun to change everything, not just for the prisoners, but for the guards who watched them work in silence, wondering what kind of nation could afford such mercy. Across the American heartland, the landscape of captivity was strangely ordinary. Prison camps often stood beside quiet towns, their fences blending into cornfields and forests. At sunrise, the prisoners marched out in work details, guarded but unthreatened, to harvest crops or repair roads. By evening, they returned singing, old German folk tunes drifting across the fields. For the Americans who lived nearby, it was a strange sight. Their sons were fighting in Europe. Yet here, behind barbed wire, stood the enemy, laughing, smoking, and writing letters home. Some locals resented it deeply. Others, especially farmers, saw the humanity behind the uniform. "They're just boys," one Kansas farmer told a reporter in 1944, "and boys need something to believe in." Inside the camps, belief became a kind of survival. Religion offered routine, dignity, and forgiveness, things that no ideology could counterfeit. The War Department's prisoner of war branch quietly encouraged it. It wasn't an act of charity. It was part of re-education. America understood that no army could win peace without reshaping the minds of those it defeated. And so, a subtle transformation began. Not through propaganda, but example chaplains, both American and German, became the silent diplomats of the camps. They moved freely between prisoners and guards, teaching sermons that replaced hatred with reflection. For the first time, many POWs heard Christian teachings without racial distortion, without the blood and soil rhetoric that had poisoned faith in Nazi Germany. They began to write about it in letters home. "The Americans treat us like men," one prisoner wrote from Camp Swift, Texas. "They let us pray in peace. I wonder if they pray for us too." The U.S. military allowed not only prayer services, but choirs, religious festivals, and Christmas observances. When the holidays came, local churches often sent carolers to sing outside the fences. Some guards joined them. Even through wire and rifles, the sound of Stille Nacht, silent night, carried across the frozen camp yards like a reminder that civilization hadn't died in the rubble of Europe. To the prisoners, this freedom was deeply unsettling. They had been told America was a land of greed and moral decay, a place without faith, without order. Yet here, the very enemy of Germany allowed them to worship openly, even helping them build places to do it. "If this is the enemy," another prisoner wrote in his diary, "then our leaders have lied to us." It was precisely that realization that American officials hoped would take root. The Office of War Information understood that every act of decency was also an act of persuasion. Where Nazi camps had been built on fear, American ones were built on law. And where Hitler's soldiers demanded obedience, the Americans demanded conscience. Still, the contrast wasn't without complexity. Not every camp was harmonious. Some prisoners remained die-hard Nazis, enforcing discipline and punishing those who spoke kindly of their captors. Secret meetings were held in barracks. Swastikas were carved into wooden bunks. At Camp Tonkawa, tensions erupted when anti-Nazi prisoners were attacked by their own comrades. A reminder that ideology could not be erased overnight. But even then, the Americans refused collective punishment. Investigations were calm, trials were held, and sentences handed out under military law, not vengeance. For the prisoners who witnessed this, the lesson was unmistakable. In America, even the guilty were given a voice. By 1945, as the war drew to a close, hundreds of chapels stood inside U.S. POW camps. Some simple sheds, others beautifully built with stained glass and painted murals. The most famous of them, at Camp Aliceville in Alabama, was adorned with hand-carved altars, crucifixes, and a mural of Christ painted by a captured German artist named Hans-Jürgen Kallmann. The irony was profound. While Allied bombers destroyed German cities by night, German prisoners built sanctuaries by day, on American soil, under American protection. When visitors from the International Red Cross toured the camps, they reported astonishment. The prisoners enjoy conditions of life which fully meet the Geneva requirements, one inspection noted. Religious liberty is complete. For the Americans, this policy had become more than compliance. It was a quiet declaration of identity. The United States was proving, even to its enemies, that strength need not rely on hatred. And for the Germans who prayed beneath those makeshift roofs, the meaning ran deeper still. They had entered captivity expecting chains, and discovered freedom of the soul. It was this quiet transformation, born from lumber, hymns, and unexpected mercy, that set the stage for what would come next. The building of the first chapel inside an American POW camp, and the morning when faith itself became a bridge between enemies. For the German soldiers who arrived in America, captivity began with disbelief. Most had been taught that surrender meant degradation. Their propaganda officers had warned them that Allied forces would torture, starve, or kill them. Yet when the trains stopped at camps across the U.S., they saw something that shook those assumptions to their core. Decency. The guards spoke plainly, gave clear orders, and rarely raised their voices. Meals came on time, bread warm, soup thick. The wounded were treated in clean infirmaries by army medics who made no distinction between friend and foe. Slowly, suspicion began to erode. It wasn't instant conversion. Hatred doesn't dissolve overnight, but it began to crack under the weight of normal human kindness. The chapel became a symbol of that change. To many prisoners, it was the first thing they had built without orders, the first act of creation after years of destruction. As one former prisoner from Camp Algona, Iowa, later recalled, "When we raised that cross, it was the first time I felt like a man again. Not a soldier, not a captive, just a man." For guards who watched them, the transformation was equally human. Some were small-town boys who had never met a German before. They expected monsters, found men their own age, and learned that faith, even in an enemy tongue, could sound familiar. When hymns rose from the camp chapel on Sundays, some guards would stand outside the fence, listening quietly. Humanity had found its echo between enemies. Behind this compassion lay deliberate policy. The U.S. Army didn't want its soldiers to grow cruel through victory. Commanders such as Lieutenant General Brahan Somerville insisted that discipline could coexist with dignity. The aim was not only to obey the Geneva Convention, but to turn morality into a weapon, a demonstration that democracy could outclass dictatorship even in captivity. Each camp was expected to uphold standards that reflected American ideals. No forced conversions, no humiliation, no propaganda. If prisoners broke rules, they were punished through military justice, not vengeance. For every act of mercy, there was calculation. The War Department knew that how America treated its prisoners would influence how Germany treated Allied captives and shape post-war opinion. But something unexpected happened. The policy began to outgrow its purpose. What started as strategy turned into conviction. Guards who once followed the rules mechanically began to believe in them. They saw that mercy didn't weaken discipline. It strengthened respect. Many later admitted that their time guarding POWs taught them more about the meaning of America than combat ever had. The moral victory was subtle, but immense. In a world drowning in atrocity, the POW camps became moral islands. Imperfect, yes, but governed by law, conscience, and restraint. When prisoners built chapels instead of barracks, they weren't just exercising religious rites. They were witnessing a nation living its own ideals under pressure. Religion had always followed armies, but rarely under such strange circumstances. Among the thousands of German prisoners were priests, chaplains, and seminarians captured on the battlefield. The U.S. Army allowed them to resume pastoral duties inside the camps. They were given access to religious texts, communion supplies, and permission to conduct services under guard supervision. Soon, every major camp had a functioning parish of sorts. Lutheran and Catholic services alternated weekly. Protestant hymns were sung beside Catholic masses. The Americans provided materials when they could. Bibles printed in German, hymnals, and candles. But most of what filled the chapels was made by hand. Crucifixes carved from scrap wood, altars built from packing crates, stained glass windows painted on wax paper using dyes from workshops. The services became moments of reflection, not only for the prisoners, but for their captors. We could hear them praying for their families, for peace, for forgiveness, one American guard later told an interviewer. And I realized they weren't praying to win. They were praying to end. Inside the chapel, uniforms meant nothing. Rank dissolved. Men who once shouted orders now knelt side by side. Faith, stripped of propaganda, returned to its simplest form: confession, humility, and hope. Even American chaplains were struck by it. Some wrote in their journals that they had never seen faith so fragile and so fierce at once. One Catholic chaplain in Camp McCain, Mississippi, wrote, "Their chapel is made of crates, their candles of waxed paper, yet their prayers sound stronger than any cathedrals." What neither side realized at first was that these moments were reshaping the moral fabric of post-war Europe long before the fighting ended. For many POWs, this was their first encounter with a Christianity unchained from ideology, a faith that asked for forgiveness, not obedience. As one German priest whispered during a Christmas service in 1944, "God has found us through our enemies." By the end of 1944, across hundreds of American camps, chapels had become sanctuaries not only of worship, but of reawakening. Here the lines between victor and vanquished blurred, not through weakness, but through shared belief. And yet the story was far from over. Beyond the hymnals and crosses lay deeper tensions, moments where faith clashed with loyalty, and conscience tested command. To understand what those chapels truly meant, one must first remember what kind of culture those prisoners came from. In Nazi Germany, the state dictated belief. Churches that resisted were silenced, pastors imprisoned, and faith reshaped into a national creed of obedience. Worship had become performance, loyalty to Führer and fatherland masquerading as religion. So when German POWs stepped into American camps and were told, "You may pray as you wish," they did not believe it at first. To them, religion had always been something supervised, not granted freely. Yet the Americans offered no conditions, no sermons of conversion. They simply stepped aside. That act alone was revolutionary. In the space of those wooden chapels, the prisoners encountered an unfamiliar version of Christianity, one that belonged not to politics, but to conscience. Protestant and Catholic worshippers, who had been divided by suspicion back home, now shared the same benches. Americans allowed them to invite chaplains of their choice. When they asked for bells to call the men to service, officers approved it. For many Germans, that single word, allowed, carried more weight than any sermon. They realized that freedom of belief was not chaos, but order built on trust. It was the first time they saw liberty not as weakness, but as moral strength. Some chapels even displayed both crucifixes and stars of David, in quiet defiance of the ideology they had once served. To worship without fear, beside men of different faiths, was an unthinkable idea in Hitler's Reich. And yet, in the middle of America, that idea became a living reality. Years later, many of those same prisoners would remember that moment as the one that changed them. One recalled, "They showed us that power can stand beside faith, not above it. War breaks more than bodies. It unravels the mind, the certainty, the pride, the sense of meaning. For many POWs, faith became the thread that kept them from losing themselves completely. At first, many prayed for release. Later, they prayed for forgiveness. Over time, they began to pray simply to endure. Psychologists who visited the camps after the war described religion as an act of mental repair. Inside those small wooden chapels, the men began to rebuild an inner world that had been destroyed by years of propaganda and violence. In their sermons, German chaplains spoke about redemption, not victory. They quoted scriptures about confession and rebuilding. Even those who had been loyal Nazis began to sit in silence, heads bowed, not yet repentant, but reflective. The chapel offered what no cell or punishment could: a chance to confront guilt without humiliation. American guards noticed the change. Fights lessened. Obedience improved. Many prisoners began to volunteer for extra work, crafting benches or painting murals for the chapel walls. When psychologists later interviewed them, one prisoner answered simply, "We needed something that made us human again." For the Americans, too, the psychological effect was real. The guards, far from the front lines, struggled with their own war weariness and grief. Watching former enemies build altars and pray reminded them why the war had begun: to defend the freedom they were now extending. In the shared stillness of those chapels, both sides found an uneasy peace, not yet friendship, but recognition. None of it would have been possible without the quiet courage of American officers who chose principle over anger. Men like Colonel Clarence Babcock, commander at Camp Aliceville, or Captain John Pratt at Camp Atterbury, who allowed prisoners to use government lumber to build their chapels despite public criticism. To the press, such leniency seemed naive. "Why let Nazis pray?" one newspaper asked. "They prayed for Hitler once." But Babcock and others held firm. Their orders came from higher ground: the War Department's prisoner of war branch, which demanded adherence to the Geneva Convention to the letter and spirit. In their official memos, they often used moral language rarely seen in military documents. One line read, "Mercy is not a favor, it is the measure of civilization." These officers believed that the POW program was as much a test of America as of its captives. If they failed to uphold decency, victory would mean little. And so when German prisoners asked to build chapels, the decision was made not from pity, but from conviction. The officers understood that freedom must be demonstrated, not declared. They believed that letting the enemy build a house of worship was not weakness. It was proof that America's strength came from faith in its own ideals. Their restraint would ripple far beyond the camps. After the war, many of those same commanders helped shape policies for the re-education of Germany, emphasizing democracy, conscience, and human rights. Lessons first tested behind barbed wire. By the winter of 1944, the story had come full circle. What began as a legal obligation had become a moral revelation. In camps surrounded by fences and guarded by rifles, men had found faith again, and through it, glimpses of a freedom they had never known. Soon, that quiet experiment would reach its peak. A group of prisoners in Oklahoma would begin building not just a place to pray, but a monument to the very idea that defeated them. Winter of 1944. Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. The war in Europe was still raging, but here, thousands of miles away, a different kind of battle was unfolding. One fought not with weapons, but with conscience. The prisoners had been whispering about it for weeks. A permanent chapel, not a makeshift shed or tent, but a real building, something that could stand through storms. It began as a request written in careful English and handed to the American camp commander. A Lutheran chaplain among the prisoners wanted permission to build a small house of prayer. The commander, Captain Kenneth H. Drake, read the note twice. He had spent 2 years managing captured soldiers, some courteous, others defiant. The war had turned good men hard, but he was no brute. He knew what the rules said. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could worship freely. But a full structure? That was another matter. It meant tools, nails, wood, labor and time away from assigned work details. The debate went up the chain of command. Some officers objected. "They'll turn it into a rally hall." Others hesitated. The request, they admitted, was unusual. But the War Department's answer was clear. Allow it, so the word spread. The Germans could build their chapel. Within days, volunteers stepped forward. Carpenters, masons, and artists among the prisoners. Men who once built bridges for the Wehrmacht now planning walls for worship. The Americans provided minimal materials, a few planks, nails, and cement. But the rest came from scavenged scraps, old crates, wire, even torn canvas from supply tents. It wasn't an order, it was an act of choice, and that alone made it powerful. Under gray winter skies, the men began to work. They designed the chapel themselves. Simple, rectangular, wooden. A single aisle, a small altar, a window facing east. The architecture echoed home, plain Lutheran simplicity, no grandeur, no symbols of power, just space for prayer. At first the guards watched with suspicion. Hammers echoed through the frosty mornings. Sawdust clung to the air. The prisoners built quietly, almost reverently. There were no songs, no banners, no speeches. Only the rhythmic sound of nails meeting wood. By mid-December the frame stood tall, sunlight cutting through unfinished planks. Inside, a group of prisoners knelt to lay the first crossbeam. One of them, Sergeant Karl Mertens, a former carpenter from Hamburg, whispered a verse from Psalms. "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." The Americans standing nearby heard it, though they didn't understand the words. But they recognized the tone. Not defiance, not pride, but gratitude. When the roof was complete, they placed a crude wooden cross at the peak. It wasn't ornate. Two boards nailed together, weathered and uneven, but in that moment, it meant more than any monument. Even Captain Drake, usually reserved, walked inside after inspection. The room smelled of pine and dust. The pews were handmade, uneven but sturdy. In one corner, a small painted mural had begun. Christ surrounded by figures in ragged uniforms, reaching upward through smoke and shadow. It was haunting, almost prophetic. The American paused and said softly, "You did this yourselves?" The prisoner beside him nodded. "Yes, Captain. God gave us the time." When the chapel opened, no one expected what followed. On that first Sunday, the entire camp, nearly 2,000 prisoners, stood silently as the bells rang. They had built them from melted tin and discarded shell casings tuned by ear. The sound was rough but pure, echoing across the fields and into the nearby town. Locals paused their morning chores, listening to the strange foreign hymn carried by wind. Inside the chapel, every bench was full. Officers and privates sat side by side. There was no hierarchy, no salute. The German chaplain, his voice trembling, began the first service. Outside, American guards leaned on their rifles, heads slightly bowed. For 30 minutes, no one moved. No one shouted. The hymn, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God, filled the camp. The melody rose through the rafters, passed through open windows, and drifted toward the guard towers. To the prisoners, it was faith rediscovered. To the Americans, it was something deeper. The realization that their enemies could still believe in something pure. When the service ended, no one spoke for several moments. Captain Drake finally broke the silence. "You've built something that may outlast this war," he said. He was right. The Chapel of Tonkawa would become one of the first permanent houses of worship ever built by enemy soldiers on American soil. Years later, long after the camp closed, local residents would still recall those Sundays. The foreign hymns, the ringing bells, the sight of German prisoners praying for peace under an American flag fluttering above the fence. What began as mercy had turned into revelation. The following weeks turned the small wooden chapel into the quiet heart of Camp Tonkawa. Word of its completion spread quickly, even to other POW camps across the country. Guards spoke about it during mail runs, chaplains mentioned it in their reports, And before long, new chapels began rising in camps from Texas to Iowa, from Louisiana to the Carolinas. But Tonkawa's stood apart because of what happened next. On Christmas Eve 1944, the chapel doors opened again. This time the invitation went beyond the wire. Captain Drake had given permission for American soldiers stationed nearby, and even a few townspeople, to attend the midnight service. It was a quiet experiment, one few believed would succeed. As the cold wind swept across the plains, men and women from the nearby town of Perry arrived at the gate, escorted inside under guard. They looked nervous. Just 2 years earlier, these same Germans might have been shooting at their brothers in Europe. But curiosity outweighed resentment. Inside, the chapel glowed with lamplight. The prisoners had hung small garlands of straw and pine. The altar was draped with a white sheet stitched from flour sacks. A wooden manger sat below the cross. The scent of candle wax and pine needles mixed with cold air and sawdust. The first to speak was the camp chaplain, a thin, bespectacled German priest named Father Josef Lenz, captured in Tunisia. His sermon began in German, then shifted carefully into English. His accent was thick, his tone humble. "Tonight," he said, "there are no enemies here, only men waiting for peace." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Prisoners in patched uniforms, guards in olive coats, civilians seated stiffly on makeshift benches. "If this war ever ends," he continued, "may we remember that faith was the one thing they could not imprison." Then came the hymn, Silent Night, Stille Nacht. At first, the German voices filled the air, soft, trembling, almost afraid. Then, slowly, a few American voices joined in, uncertain but sincere. The two languages blended into one, harmony without rehearsal, reverence without command. The guard towers stood still. Rifles remained slung. The floodlights, for once, were turned off. Only the stars watched. In that moment, something passed between them that no treaty could ever right. The war, for those few minutes, felt impossibly far away. A prisoner named Heinrich Becker, a former school teacher from Dresden, later wrote in his journal, "I saw the American sergeant standing beside the cross, tears on his face. He sang the same words I sang. It was then I understood that freedom is not given by victory. It is born of mercy." The next morning, Christmas Day, the American guards found a small wooden plaque nailed above the chapel door. The inscription, carved by hand, read simply, "Erbaut in der Gefangenschaft, 1945. Built in captivity, 1944. Captain Drake ordered it left untouched." "It belongs there," he said. That chapel became more than a place of worship. It became a monument to contradiction. Within its walls, men who had once marched under a tyrant prayed freely under the protection of a democracy. The irony was not lost on anyone. Some called it moral propaganda. Others called it faith in practice. But for the prisoners, it was liberation of a different kind. The camp records show that behavior improved sharply after that winter. Escape attempts ceased entirely. Guards reported fewer arguments, fewer disciplinary issues, and an unspoken peace that spread through the barracks. The War Department's inspectors noted it in their reports. Camp morale is exceptional. The presence of a chapel has greatly contributed to discipline and rehabilitation. But perhaps the most remarkable effect came months later, when Allied victories made it clear that Germany was collapsing. News of Hitler's suicide reached Tonkawa in May 1945. Many prisoners wept openly, not for the dictator, but for their lost homeland. That evening, the chapel filled again. No hymns were sung, no words were spoken. The men simply sat together, heads bowed in silence. When Captain Drake entered quietly and stood at the back, one of the prisoners rose to speak. "We have lost our country," he said softly, "but we have found our souls." The guard beside him murmured, "Then maybe the war is finally ending." It was a moment of reconciliation so rare that years later, historians would call Tonkawa one of the most humane experiments of the war. The chapel survived long after the fences came down. Visitors still came to see it. A weathered wooden building with a crooked cross, standing alone on the prairie. Some locals swore that on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the faint echo of Silent Night drifting through the fields. For the Americans, it was a reminder of what they had fought to protect. For the Germans, it was proof that mercy had defeated the Reich long before the bombs ever did. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war that had begun with fire and conquest ended, at least in the United States, with hymns and forgiveness. The POW camps that dotted the American landscape began to empty. Trains lined up once again, this time to carry men home, not to battlefields but to the ruins of their own country. Camp Tonkawa was among the last to close. Its chapel still stood, untouched by weather or vandalism, a silent witness to an experiment that had succeeded beyond all expectations. For the Americans who served there, the lesson was lasting. Humanity could discipline itself without losing its soul. The War Department's final inspection reports told a story few outside the military ever read. They described the POW program as a triumph of principle over vengeance. Red Cross observers wrote that the treatment of German captives in the United States was without precedent in the history of modern warfare, where Europe had seen concentration camps and death marches. America had built schools, theaters, and chapels. The records were full of small, unremarkable details, menus, payrolls, work schedules, but hidden between them were quiet revolutions. One entry from early 1945 noted that religious observance continues to be widespread and voluntary. Another recorded, inmates express gratitude for humane treatment and demonstrate increasing respect for American values. These words might have seemed bureaucratic, but behind them lay real human change. Many former guards and chaplains kept in touch with the prisoners they once oversaw. Letters traveled across the ocean long after the camps had closed, filled with stories of rebuilding and reflection. One letter, preserved in the archives of the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps, came from a former prisoner named Otto Meyer, who had returned to Hamburg. He wrote, "When I came to America, I believed in strength. When I left, I believed in mercy. We were taught that faith belonged to the strong, but I learned that faith belongs to the free." That sentiment echoed through thousands of post-war interviews. Historians studying Germany's Reconstruction found that many ex-POWs who had been held in the United States became among the earliest advocates of democracy. They had lived under an enemy government that treated them not as captives, but as men. American officials noticed the same phenomenon. In 1947, a report by the War Department's Re-Education Division observed, "Former prisoners held in the United States demonstrate a striking degree of moderation and democratic tolerance upon return." The seeds planted behind barbed wire had taken root in the rubble of Germany. Even within the military, attitudes had shifted. American officers who had once seen the POW camps as logistical burdens began to see them as moral proving grounds. "We were training ourselves as much as we were re-educating them," one commander wrote. "Every time we treated an enemy humanely, we reminded ourselves what kind of nation we wanted to remain." But for the prisoners, the memories were more personal. Many could never forget the sight of that wooden cross rising inside the wire, or the faces of guards who stood outside the chapel and listened. In reunions decades later, when surviving POWs met in Germany, they often spoke less about battles and more about that time. The silence before Silent Night, the warmth of an American guard's nod, the strange peace that settled over a camp built for war. Some, years later, returned to America to see it again. A few found the old chapel still standing, weathered, cracked, but unmistakable. Locals had preserved it as a historical landmark. The sign still read, "Built in Captivity, 1944." It remained untouched, a scar and a prayer carved into history. For the men who once prayed there, it was proof that even captivity could hold freedom, and that the moral strength of a nation was measured not in how it fought its enemies, but in how it treated them after the fighting stopped. When the last train left Camp Tonkawa in early 1946, only wind and silence remained. Rows of barracks stood empty. The guard towers, once manned day and night, were dismantled. The barbed wire came down in coils, rolled into trucks, and hauled away. But one structure was left untouched: the small wooden chapel near the center of the camp. Captain Kenneth Drake, now preparing to return home, signed the final report with a single handwritten note in the margin: "The chapel will remain. Let it stand." For the townspeople of Perry and Tonkawa, it became a local mystery at first, a relic of war that no one had the heart to destroy. Over time, they began to care for it. A farmer whose land bordered the old camp occasionally repainted its cross. Children rode bicycles around its foundation, unaware that men who once served Hitler had knelt and prayed there. But for those who had lived it, both guards and prisoners, the meaning of that chapel lingered. Letters from former POWs continued to arrive for years, written in careful English. They spoke of lives rebuilt, of families, of gratitude. One wrote, "I still hear the bell, Captain. It rings in my mind when I think of freedom." In post-war Germany, that sentiment carried weight. The men who had seen America from behind fences became quiet messengers of democracy. They returned to a shattered nation, to cities in ruins, to families scattered, to a country humiliated and unsure. But they brought something invisible home with them: a memory of decency. Sociologists studying post-war reconstruction later called it the American paradox, that the enemy who conquered them had also taught them humanity. Thousands of former POWs joined rebuilding efforts, worked in local councils, and promoted reconciliation. Some entered the clergy, inspired by the religious freedom they had experienced in the camps. A few even helped rebuild bombed-out churches across Germany, modeling them after the wooden chapels of their captivity. In 1950, one of those men, Father Josef Lenz, the same chaplain who had led the Christmas Eve service, wrote to the town of Tonkawa. His letter was brief, addressed simply to the people of Oklahoma. "Please tell them," he wrote, "that the chapel they allowed us to build became the first lesson of peace I ever believed." The town newspaper printed it, and locals began calling the site the chapel that forgiveness built. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, historians within the U.S. Army compiled the official report on the prisoner of war program, 1942-1946. Buried among statistics and logistics was a section titled Moral and Religious Welfare. It concluded that America's policy of humane treatment achieved results of permanent psychological and cultural importance. It was rare bureaucratic language for what was, in truth, a moral victory. The chapel at Tonkawa, like many others, gradually weathered and faded. Its walls cracked, its roof sagged, yet through local preservation efforts, it was eventually restored and declared a state historical landmark in 1980. To this day, it stands, a modest structure with no marble, no plaques of triumph, just a wooden cross and a simple message carved by hands that once served tyranny. Built in captivity, 1944. Visitors often describe an uncanny stillness there. No exhibits, no recordings, only the sound of wind through grass, the faint creak of wood, the ghosts of a song that once joined two enemies in harmony. For the United States, those chapels became symbols of what victory truly meant. Not domination, but transformation. The war had been fought to destroy an ideology built on hate. And here, within fences of wire, that ideology was quietly undone by grace. The soldiers who allowed it never imagined the legacy they were creating. Yet decades later, their restraint would be studied in military ethics courses as proof that the moral strength of a nation could be as decisive as its weapons. And for the men who built those chapels, the lesson endured in silence. They had lost a homeland, but gained something greater: the understanding that true power lies not in conquest, but in the freedom to forgive. The last living German prisoner to serve at Tonkawa, interviewed in 1995, was asked what the chapel meant to him after all those years. He smiled faintly and said, "It was the first place I prayed without fear. That is what America gave me." The war that tore continents apart left behind ruins, graves, and memories steeped in loss. Yet among those ruins, in a quiet corner of Oklahoma, Something entirely different remained. A chapel built by the defeated, protected by the victors and sanctified not by power, but by mercy. History often remembers wars for their battles, the victories that reshaped maps and the weapons that changed warfare. But what happened behind the fences of America's POW camps revealed a quieter kind of triumph. It was not the clash of armies that defined this story, but the endurance of conscience in a time of chaos. The wooden chapel at Camp Tonkawa stood as proof that civilization could survive its own destruction. Inside those walls, the war's enemies met as men. They sang in a language foreign to their captors, but the meaning was universal: hope, repentance, and peace. To the Germans, the chapel became a reminder that faith and freedom could coexist, that belief did not need permission from a regime. To the Americans, it was a living reflection of what they claimed to fight for, a belief that liberty's strength is measured not by how it rewards friends, but by how it treats its foes. Decades later, when veterans and former prisoners stood together at reunions, there was no bitterness in their stories, only quiet wonder. They spoke of how strange it had been to find decency in the enemy's hands, and how that decency had reshaped their understanding of victory. The war ended in 1945, but the moral echo of those chapels still lingers, in the wind across the plains, in the soft creak of old wood, in the idea that even in war's darkest hours, humanity can still choose compassion. Because somewhere between the fences and the cross, between obedience and forgiveness, both sides learned the same truth: that freedom is not just something one wins, it is something one gives.